Mount Merapi is a 9,550-foot tall volcano located in the central portion of the island of Java in Indonesia. Mount Merapi is a composite volcano, one of three distinct classifications of volcanoes. Composite volcanoes are distinctly defined by their uneven, steep conical shape that even further steepens near the top. Their high topographical distinction sets them apart from shield volcanoes, while their uneven composition distinctly sets them apart from the similarly shaped and much more common cinder cone volcanoes. The reason for their wildly varying topography is rooted in the way each type of volcano erupts, as shield volcanoes tend to erupt rather gently over great periods of time, and as the lava flows down its structure, it hardens in layers, which creates the massive elongated shield-like appearance that such volcanoes derive their name from. Shield volcano eruptions typically register a volcano explosivity index rating of 0, effusive, or 1, severe. Cinder cone volcanoes bear the more classic conical shape with a crater on top that likely comes to mind when you hear the word volcano, and are formed by lava flows that harden, and then are encased by layers of scoria. Scoria are fragments of lava that are flung into the air during eruptions, which harden while in the air, creating a layer of small, nut to fist-sized scoria, or cinders, that this type of volcano derives its name from. Most cinder cone volcano eruptions register a volcano explosivity index rating of 2, explosive, and 3, catastrophic, although there have been cinder cone volcano eruptions that have reached an index rating of 4, cataclysmic. Composite volcanoes, however, are typically active for a long period of time, spanning for hundreds of thousands of years, erupting somewhat regularly but also sporadically, with irregular periods of dormancy between major eruptions. Large composite volcano eruptions typically register a volcano explosivity index rating of 4, cataclysmic, or 5, paroxysmal. A well-known example of a VEI rated 5 eruption was the deadly 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens that claimed the lives of 57 people. In September of 2010, Mount Merapi began to show signs of an imminent eruption in the near future. On September 12th, observers in the nearby towns of Babadan and Kaliurang reported that they had heard what sounded like an avalanche coming from Mount Merapi. 2 days later, on September 14th, a plume of white smoke began to rise from the summit of Mount Merapi. Mount Merapi's imminent eruption was even further evidenced by its swelling lava dome, which had noticeably begun inflating earlier that year in March at a steady rate of approximately 0.1 to 0.3 millimeters per day, but by September 16th, the dome had begun to rapidly increase in size, now swelling at a rate of 11 millimeters per day. Over the following few days, a number of earthquakes also began to jostle the region, and by September 19th, these earthquakes had become so frequent that the Center for Volcanology and Geological Hazard Mitigation increased the alert level for the region from a 1 to a 2, with their alert system scale ranging from a 1 to a 4. Over the following few weeks, frequent seismic activities continued to rock the region, while the lava dome atop the mountain continued to grow at an alarming rate. By October 21st, the dome was now growing at a rate of 105 millimeters per day. However, the lava dome's trend of exponential growth would even further skyrocket over the next few days, and just 3 days later, on October 24th, the dome was now inflating at a rate of 420 millimeters per day. Furthermore, the previous day on October 23rd, lava was observed flowing down the Gendel River, which continued on through the 24th as well. These findings all pointed experts to the conclusion that Mount Merapi would certainly erupt within the next few days. On the morning of October 25th, 2010, Center for Volcanology and Geological Hazard Mitigation officials raised the alert level to a 4, the highest level, and ordered an immediate evacuation for everyone within a 10-kilometer radius of Mount Merapi, an area which was inhabited by approximately 19,000 people. Both authorities and inhabitants of the region alike frantically scrambled to escape the exclusion zone as the region was shaken by the now nearly constant seismic activity. By October 25th, the lava dome had further increased in its growth, now inflating at a rate of approximately 500 millimeters per day. That afternoon, as officials and local residents were still in the process of evacuating, at 2:04 p.m., Mount Merapi began to violently erupt, spewing enormous quantities of lava down its south and southeast slopes. Just after this eruption had seemingly begun to quiet, at 2:24 p.m., it began to violently erupt again. Much like the first eruption, just as the second eruption had seemingly begun to lessen in its ferocity, at 3:15 p.m., Mount Merapi began its third eruption, spewing yet more lava and volcanic material down the south and southeast slopes. Following this third eruption, the volcano again began to quiet. This would mark the final eruption on the 25th, with a whopping 222 volcanic seismic events being recorded in the region on the 25th. The following day, on October 26th, throughout the morning and afternoon, locals braced for another eruption, and after experiencing no major eruptions for most of the daytime, finally, at 6:02 p.m. that evening, Mount Merapi erupted again, this time with much greater explosivity and violence than any of the eruptions that had occurred on the 25th, spewing enormous amounts of lava, but this time accompanied by huge, fast-moving pyroclastic flows as well. Pyroclastic flows are massive plumes of hot volcanic ash, smoke, and other gases known as tephra that are emitted during particularly explosive eruptions. Pyroclastic flows are extremely hot and fast-moving, often reaching temperatures of 1,000 degrees Celsius and moving at speeds ranging from 100 kilometers per hour to 700 kilometers per hour. And thus, pyroclastic flows are extremely deadly to any living creatures that are unfortunate enough to find themselves within their unrelenting paths, and are the cause of a majority of human deaths following volcanic eruption events. The massive pyroclastic flows on Mount Merapi continue to sweep down its slopes, with the hot tephra continually spewing from it, spurred on by 12 further eruption events, until the pyroclastic activity finally began to subside that evening. As the 26th drew to a close, a huge 1.5 kilometer high vertical plume of white smoke billowing from Mount Merapi's crater could be observed. Following this eruption, emergency personnel were sent into the region to search for survivors and the dead, as they knew that with the pyroclastic flows would likely come numerous casualties. As emergency workers canvassed the affected areas, they inevitably began to find people who had perished, and by 11 p.m. that evening, it was confirmed that 18 people were dead, mostly residents from small villages that lined Mount Merapi's slopes. By the morning of October 27th, the death toll had risen to 25 people, including Mount Merapi's spiritual gatekeeper, who lived in a small home just 2.5 miles from the peak. By October 28th, the death toll from the eruptions had again risen to 30 people, with 13 further people hospitalized, mostly for burns. However, Mount Merapi still was showing signs that a further eruption was quite likely. In the early morning hours of October 29th, Mount Merapi again began to erupt. The eruptions on the 29th billowed numerous immense pyroclastic flows from the volcano's crater, which wafted down the Lamont River, the Crossock River, and the Sonoa River from 7:23 a.m. that morning to 9:40 p.m. that evening. Following the numerous pyroclastic eruptions on October 29th, the chief of the Center for Volcanology and Geological Hazard Mitigation released a statement that officials were optimistic that this would be the final major eruption event, as evidence they had collected suggested that the magma pressure amassed within the massive lava dome that had been forming in Mount Merapi's crater had been greatly eased by the eruptions. However, despite the optimism of officials, some of whom had studied Mount Merapi for over 15 years, the eruption on October 29th would not be its last. In fact, it would only be a matter of mere hours before Mount Merapi would prove officials' predictions to be dead wrong, as in the early morning hours of October 30th, it began to erupt again, with greater explosivity and ferocity than even the eruptions on the 26th. This eruption was more powerful than anyone had seemingly anticipated, expelling enormous amounts of lava and sending huge pyroclastic flows cascading down into the valleys below. The massive cloud of ash quickly enveloped an area of 30 kilometers, 3 times the distance of the evacuation-ordered exclusion zone, and panicked residents scrambled to flee the area, clogging the roads with traffic. By 5 a.m., the massive clouds of volcanic ash encased the valley and were expelled up into the atmosphere, rising to an altitude of 11,000 feet before it was propelled westward by the winds. Following this early morning eruption on the 30th, officials warned that it was extremely likely that another powerful eruption would soon follow, as the magma from within the earth continued to push its way into Mount Merapi's lava. This prediction would prove to be correct, as later that day, just after noon, at 12:35 p.m., more massive pyroclastic flows began to erupt from Mount Merapi and careened into the valleys below. Just mere minutes after the pyroclastic flows began to spill from Mount Merapi, it violently exploded, sending a colossal fireball careening 2 kilometers into the air, which further blanketed a radius of 10 kilometers with volcanic sand as a result. Following the explosive events of October 30th, the officially reported death toll of the eruptions now numbered 38, with 69,533 people displaced as a result of the eruptions. Notably, 37 of the deceased had all hailed from the district of Sleman, along with an emergency worker from the Red Cross who had been caught in the blast zone during the eruption on October 26th. In the days following its eruption on October 30th, Mount Merapi had seemingly begun to quiet its rage, although it continued to spew enormous quantities of hot ash into the air, with the plumes of ash reaching altitudes of 20,000 feet on November 1st. However, despite the volcano remaining clearly quite active, emergency personnel seized this window of lessened seismic activity to more extensively scour the affected areas for potential survivors and the dead alike. Unfortunately, this window of opportunity would not last long, as on the morning of November 3rd, more massive pyroclastic flows began to erupt from the mountain's crater and crashed into the valleys below. By noon, over 38 distinct pyroclastic flows had erupted from the mountain, which as a result had encased the southern valley in an enormous cloud of ash 2.5 miles wide and 4,000 feet high. These morning-time pyroclastic flows were then followed by the most explosive eruption to date, which violently spewed thick clouds of hot volcanic gases and large quantities of ash 16,000 feet into the air. This powerful eruption would also prove to be the longest eruption to date, as it had actively erupted into the evening, spewing seemingly endless pyroclastic flows from within its crater. By the following day, November 4th, the volcano was still actively erupting. However, the region was also blanketed by heavy rains on the 4th, which triggered powerful, hot volcanic mud flows known as lahars. These lahars were accompanied by numerous, even larger pyroclastic flows that reached temperatures of 600 to 800 degrees Celsius and traveled as far as 11.5 kilometers from Mount Merapi's crater. On the morning of November 5th, several more explosive eruptions spewed from Mount Merapi, and like the eruptions on October 26th and October 30th before it, the intensity of the eruption on the morning of November 5th had proven to be even greater than the last eruption on November 3rd, and further blanketed the surrounding 10-kilometer exclusion zone with hot ash, and soon, thick layers of ash began to accumulate in the surrounding areas, with an ash layer 30 centimeters deep reported in one village approximately 15 kilometers from the summit. This larger than expected blast radius and the constant eruptions, along with their increasing intensity, spurred officials to increase the size of the evacuation exclusion zone from a radius of 10 kilometers to a radius of 20 kilometers from Mount Merapi. By 3 p.m. that afternoon, the official casualty count now numbered 122 people deceased, with officials further noting that at least 64 of them had died as a result of the eruptions earlier that day. This official press release also noted that a majority of the casualties had perished in the Sleman district. Furthermore, the catastrophic eruptions had caused the number of people displaced by the eruptions to now number over 100,000. The eruptions on November 5th had spewed so much ash into the atmosphere that it was reported via satellite imagery that the cloud of ash reached an altitude of 55,000 feet at its highest point, with its width spanning 190 nautical miles from Mount Merapi. The next day, November 6th, Mount Merapi remained active and continued to spew smoke, ash, and flames that reached heights of 3 kilometers into the air as it continued to actively erupt. The volcano continued to maintain its active state throughout the 6th and into the 7th. However, by the 7th, authorities began to have difficulties keeping people out of the 20-kilometer exclusion zone, as the refugees desperately sought to return to the area to assess the devastating damages to their homes and look for lost or dead loved ones. By the end of the 7th, the death toll now numbered 135, with hundreds of people still hospitalized. The high-intensity eruptions that had been a constant since November 3rd continued into their 5th straight day as Mount Merapi continued to billow hot, volcanic gases and ash into the atmosphere above, with the plumes reaching heights of 13,000 feet. By November 9th, the explosivity of the eruptions had begun to noticeably subside, which allowed emergency personnel a window to better scour the surrounding areas for casualties. Later on the 9th, Indonesian government officials released the latest casualty count, with the dead now numbering at least 153 people, with the estimated number of people displaced reaching 320,000 people. Despite signs that the volcano's eruption had been diminishing in its intensity, on November 10th, more pyroclastic flows cascaded from Mount Merapi's crater and into the valleys below. These recurring pyroclastic flows continued on through November 11th, with some still extending as far as 3 kilometers from the epicenter of the eruptions. And as Mount Merapi continued to erupt, so too did the casualty count grow, with official reports released on November 11th now listing 194 people as deceased. Over the course of the next week, the eruptions steadily continued, although with each passing day, the eruptions lessened in their ferocity. But to volcanology experts, it remained clear that the exclusion zone was still far from safe, and officials retained the alert level of 4 and maintained the 20-kilometer exclusion zone, although emergency personnel were allowed entry into the area to look for the missing and dead. Official reports released on November 18th truly reflected the magnitude of the severity of the eruptions, as the death toll was now reported at 275 people killed in the eruptions since October 26th. The constant, violent eruptions continued to spew from Mount Merapi for the remainder of the month of November, with the exclusion zone and alert level of 4 being maintained until December 3rd, when the alert level was downgraded to 3 and the exclusion zone reduced to a radius of 2.5 miles. The final death count, released by officials on December 3rd, reported that the number of individuals that had perished as a result of the eruptions now had reached a staggering 353 people. In the aftermath of the catastrophic eruptions, the havoc and destruction wrought by the weeks of near-continuous eruptions was both widespread and immense. The damages caused by the eruptions were estimated to be valued at 33 billion Indonesian rupiah, which, with adjustment for inflation, is valued at approximately 4.3 million US dollars in current currency as of the making of this video. The process of rebuilding and recovering from the devastating events was a long one for many of the hundreds of thousands of displaced residents of the affected areas, despite a huge outpouring of international support and foreign aid money, and it was further reported that over 500 people who had survived the eruptions while within the blast radius suffered with lingering mental issues as a result of the unimaginable horrors and trauma that they had endured within the exclusion zone. The Sleman district in particular had been ravaged by the eruptions, which was also where a majority of the 353 deceased were located by emergency personnel. The destruction was so immense that some small villages that were situated at altitudes as high as 5,500 feet above sea level along the slopes of Mount Merapi were almost entirely seared from existence, and farmlands in the surrounding valleys were coated with volcanic ash. The damages caused by the eruptions extended beyond the immediate local area as well, as the long period of eruptions had disrupted air travel in the region, causing the cancellation of over 100 flights due to the immense clouds of ash clouding the skies. Perhaps the most telling indicator of the explosive violence of the eruptions, however, was Mount Merapi itself, as following the eruptions, it had shed 125 feet from its summit height, with the principal shape of the mountain showing obvious scarring from the volcanic blasts. Despite the numerous difficulties of rebuilding after such a devastating disaster, the local people did manage to rebuild what they had lost to the eruptions, as Mount Merapi has frequently erupted throughout history, and rebuilding after such an event is largely accepted as a part of life for the local people. However, volcanologists have concluded that these eruptions in 2010 were the most powerful and explosive that had been seen in nearly 200 years, as the last eruption of such magnitude was recorded in 1822. Notably, however, this was not the most deadly eruption in Mount Merapi's history, as an eruption in 1930 would ultimately take the lives of nearly 1,300 people, with the high death toll coming from a combination of a string of villages that were situated in the path of pyroclastic flows, and a lack of modern warning or evacuation measures to help mitigate the loss of life. Following the 2010 eruptions, Mount Merapi has remained active, and as of the making of this video, is experiencing another period of increased volcanic activity presently. Fortunately, the lessons learned from the horrific events of the 2010 eruptions have clearly been apparent, as officials have proven to be willing to issue evacuation orders at the first signs of escalating activity, a measure that has undoubtedly saved numerous lives. Thank you all for watching.